This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this week's episode, where I'm speaking to plant expert and forest garden creator, Alan Carter. Alan's latest book, A Food Forest in Your Garden, teaches you how to grow your own seasonal food in a low-maintenance, nature-friendly garden that feels like a woodland glade. First up, I ask Alan that tricky question, what is a forest garden? I recorded the interview via the internet, so apologies for the slightly dodgy patches of sound quality.
Yeah, ideas vary wildly, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think forest gardening in Britain is in an experimental phase, and that's all good. But for me, a forest garden is not a garden in the forest. The garden is the forest. And for me, it's very important that it's a productive system. It's something that you're growing to grow food or maybe medicine or other products. And for me, it's primarily food. So it's a food growing system that has the structure of a forest, or at least mimics the structure of the forest, in order to get some of the resilience and the productivity of a forest.
And is our UK climate suited to having forest gardens?
Yes, definitely, which doesn't mean you can just transplant, say, an Indonesian forest garden, either in terms of the species, which obviously won't work, or in terms of the structure. Everything is different here, but the principles are broadly the same, so you can apply those principles. And for me, that kind of goes twice, because most of the research that's been done in the UK has been in the southwest of England, in fairly nice microclimates. And a lot of that doesn't really apply to the northeast of Scotland, where I'm gardening. So a lot of what I've done is really checking up the findings that other people have made elsewhere and seeing if they really apply here.
Is there kind of a minimum size that you might want, do you think?
I think to get the real sort of forest dynamics going, a forest garden does have to be more than one tree size, if you like. But it doesn't have to be big by any means. Mine is in an allotment, which is about 200 square metres. And there's plenty of room in that for a forest garden. There's no need for it to be a large field or anything like that. I think your average town garden can have something with some of the dynamics, at least, of a forest garden.
And you mentioned in your book, actually, that you're garden on an allotment. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about any issues you might have had in terms of looking at your plot and thinking that it doesn't look like a traditional food producing plot.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm quite lucky in where my allotment is. First, it's very close to my house, which means it's almost like having a garden. The other thing is it's quite a small site, so I can know all the people on it. I can talk to them about what I'm doing and so on. But the next stage after that is the sort of council management. And I did get a letter at one point saying, you're clearly not cultivating your allotment. Get your act together or we're going to throw you off. And I wrote back with an email that I think ran to about 6 lines of things I'd already harvested that year by about May, and 6 more things I was still going to harvest. And a request, could they come and sort of see what I was doing and what I was growing. So I ended up dragging some poor women around the allotment and saying, and use this bit of this thing, until she finally sort of said, okay, yeah, I get it. You are growing food here. And I had an experience on another allotment, which was a private allotment site, where the allotment committee simply refused to engage in that conversation. I did lose my plot, which didn't have a single weed on it. There wasn't anything inedible growing on it, but it wasn't things they recognised. And so, yeah, it can be tricky.
Wow, that is quite shocking, really, isn't it? That you actually got booted out, and quite scary. Obviously, you've made a few different gardens on different sites. Can it be difficult or expensive to start a forest garden? Because when I was looking through your book, I was thinking, I don't know this plant. I've never heard of this plant. I wouldn't know where to begin sourcing it. So is it a slow burn that you need to kind of build up your stock gradually, or can you just go out and buy the stuff that you might need if you go to the right nurseries?
Only if you're rich. It's definitely a slow burn. It's one of the big fallacies, I think, in forest gardening, perhaps promoted by permaculture, that you sort of start with a plan and everything's planned out and then you just plant it all. And that certainly hasn't been my experience for quite a lot of reasons. But one of the reasons is the cost factor that you're talking about. Forest garden plants tend to cost more, but you only ever have to buy them once because they're either perennial or they're self-seeding. So the cost is a big bang all at once, but then you're not having to pay that cost year after year. So maybe overall it comes out the same. Also, they can be difficult to get hold of, as you alluded to there. And also they can be difficult to raise. Our sort of traditional annual crops tend to be quite easy to grow from seed. The things that have been selected to germinate easily, whereas a lot of the forest garden plants are much wilder and they've got a lot more of the natural dormancy of seeds that can be hard to break. So, yeah, you need to put more effort into the initial raising of plants, even if you get them from seed. So it's taken me a long time to build up the collection I've got. And some of the plants have cost a fair bit, but thereafter, I'm not having to pay that cost again.
And where would you go to source the plants? Would it be nurseries or seed catalogues in the main?
Again, quite a mix. Some of the things you can get from standard nurseries because they're actually sold as ornamental plants. Examples would be hostas, which are in fact grown as a crop in the Far East. Similarly, daylilies. There's quite a few things where there's an overlap. So if you have a regular nursery with a really broad stock, then you can sometimes get quite a few things from them. There's a few online ones like Crook Farm Nursery, where they're not explicitly a permaculture or forest gardening nursery, but they have a lot of the kind of plants that you want to grow. Then there are more explicitly forest gardenings, the likes of Martin Crawford's Agroforestry Research Trust. You can get things through that kind of nursery. Red Shed in Scotland. Then there's just all sorts of specialist seed swapping groups and people's websites like my own. I have a seed list. I do a lot of collecting from the allotment. I swap things, I give things away, so cuttings as well as seeds and so on. So again, coming back to why it's a slow burn thing, there's no one-stop shop for this, but if you're into it, then you sort of slowly find out the places and build up a collection.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like it's kind of part of the whole ethos is to develop your collection and get in touch with your plants and learn about them and propagate them and all the rest of it. If you could just buy it and install it, might detract a little bit from the whole thing behind it. Also, thinking about what you grow in your garden, when you wrote the book, you wrote in there that you may need to kind of get your taste buds used to the flavours of some of the plants in the forest garden. And for me, I kind of went, oh, actually, I'm not sure about that. Not that I'm a fussy eater, but I don't know if it's like a comfort thing. Would I feel comfortable eating something that didn't taste quite right? Because I might think to myself, am I doing something wrong here? Have I got the wrong species here? It's been mislabeled. So there's a lot of things that are inherent, certainly for me, in eating things that I'm not familiar with. Is it worth persevering to get your taste buds used to those different flavours?
Absolutely, yeah. But it's yet another reason to take things slowly and not take a big bang approach, is that it takes time to make that transition with different tastes. So many of the things in a forest garden are unfamiliar, that there are a lot of new tastes involved. I mean, for me, it's one of the big positives, really, of the forest gardening is the huge diversity of flavours that you get. It's food you couldn't buy, really. Or if you were buying it, you'd be paying a fortune to specialist food shops, and it's kind of all for free. But the body is naturally suspicious of new flavours, new plants, new substances. And that's for the very good reason that they can be poisonous. So it actually takes time to properly accustom your body to new flavours. And the way that works is that if you try something, I've heard it said 5 times, and you don't have any adverse reactions, then your body will sort of go, okay, this is fine. And in terms of your subjective experience, the way you'll experience that is that you'll start liking it. But what we often do is, the way I was kind of brought up with liking vegetables is that you'll finish your food till you've finished it, which is actually the worst way possible to get to like something new. Because what that does is it gives your body a bad experience with that food. And therefore, the next time you try it, you'll like it even less. So the trick really is to just try a tiny little bit of something. Don't force yourself at all. And then the next time, try a wee bit more. This is probably good advice from a safety point of view as well, but actually just from the point of view of getting to like a flavour, just ease yourself into it by trying little bits of it a few times. Eventually, you'll discover that you like it, and that therefore you're incentivized to eat more of it quite naturally. And I've gone from not liking at all to really keenly looking forward to quite a lot of things every year, but just by doing that.
That's a really interesting thought, just in terms of food and eating in general, actually, that you can kind of train yourself not only to like a flavour, but to really, really look forward to it. I mean, one of the things you talk about in your book actually is something called Turkish rocket, which may not taste that different to other things that we've eaten, but it's certainly something that people, I think, probably aren't aware of. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, Turkish rocket actually does taste definitely a bit different. I often compare it to perennial broccoli in terms of the part you eat, and it's quite closely related as well. It's in that cabbage family. But it's got a taste that's a wee bit sort of shellfishy. And if you're used to eating brassicas like broccoli and cabbage, it's just quite strange. And the first time I tried it, I did not like it at all. But it's now something I've got used to, and I keenly look forward to in its season. And it's one I often use to illustrate the advantage of perennial plants, because that's the core principle really of a forest garden, is mostly perennial plants, although self-seeders as well. And I make this comparison with perennial broccoli to show how perennial plants differ from annual and biennial ones. So if you think about perennial broccoli or any annual plant really, once you've finished harvesting it, you pull it up, you put it on the compost, and what you're left with is bare soil. And the bare soil doesn't hold on to nutrients very well, so nutrients might get washed out at that point in the soil. Also, you're back to raising plants anew from seed. You've got to weed those seedlings. You've got to protect them from being eaten by slugs and snails and everything else. It's all quite a bit of work. What happens with Turkish rocket is once you've finished harvesting it, it runs to flower. And it has masses of lovely yellow flowers that are really attractive to things like hoverflies and butterflies. So it's good for wildlife, but also the wildlife is good for your garden. Hoverflies, their larvae eat greenfly. And when I first got the allotment, it had terrible trouble with greenfly. I now rarely see one. And it's because pest control kind of comes for free with the perennials and with the diversity of the forest garden. Things are in balance. There isn't the monoculture that a pest can come in and take advantage of. You also find weeding comes to a large extent for free because the plant is still occupying the soil, and so there isn't the room for weeds to come into. Also because the plant's still occupying the soil and the space, it's still photosynthesizing, it's still scavenging nutrients from the soil, so it's not letting go of any nutrients. And the fertility the system comes for free to a large degree as well. Forests are very good at holding on to fertility. I studied forestry at university, and that's one of the things we were taught. I think since I did that, we've learned a lot more about how mycorrhizae and such contribute to that process. But even just the perennial root system in the soil is part of that holding on to nutrients. So I sometimes call forest gardening how to have your garden and eat it. Because when I first planted my allotment, I kind of had an area for plants for wildlife, and I had an area for plants for attractive, and I had an area for food. What I find, because all of these things come for free with perennials, is that the food plants actually provide all these functions. So I'm having my wildlife garden, I'm having my beautiful place to be, but I'm also having the food production in the same place for free.
Again, I think that ties back into the fact that it's a slow process. It sounds as if that you either need to have a very good knowledge of your plants before you start or as you go along, or you need to be very observant and note which plants are working with others. And like you say, if you want to keep everything as a system that manages itself, you need to be making sure you're putting the right plants in the right places and picking the correct things. In view of that, I was reading your book. There are so many different plants in it. And I know this is a very, very difficult question to answer. But if you had one tree that you considered essential in a forest garden, what would be the kind of first thing that you might put in?
There is no essential plant in a forest garden. The key to the forest garden is the diversity, not any particular species. I would say to folks, start with what you like. If you like apples, plant an apple tree. If you like pears, plant a pear tree. If you like plums, you see where I'm going. And also bear in mind that it's not all about trees. One key thing about growing in a temperate climate, and particularly a cool temperate climate like mine, is that the ground layer is at least important as the tree layer. So don't neglect that when you're thinking about what to plant. So I guess I'd say start with the things in the book that are familiar and you like. Start with things you can get your hands on and just slowly build your way up.
Yeah, that's good advice. And if you weren't sure whether you like the taste of something, is there any way people might be able to go to taste these things? You know, I'm thinking sort of anywhere in the UK, really.
I guess try and find someone locally who's doing forest gardening and is willing to take visits. I'm always happy to show people around mine. And I have had folk coming from London and fairly far afield sometimes for visits, although obviously usually it's more locally. There is a network of forest gardens. I think Martin Crawford keeps a list. And also there's local groups on Facebook and whatnot where you could try to get a visit to a forest garden. I'd also mention botanic gardens as a really useful resource. They grow a lot of plants which are used in forest gardens, and certainly my local one has been quite helpful in terms of letting me take samples and so on for cuttings or for edibility tests and so on. Again, ask around, I guess.
Yeah, it does sound like it's really quite a collaborative movement, again, which appeals to me. You did mention then that you have some vegetables and things in your book that people will recognise. And I was really fascinated by your treatment of some of the more familiar things that people might grow. And so I wondered if you could say a little bit about how you deal with kales and radishes, because I think it's quite different to how most people might grow them.
Yeah, absolutely. So with kales, they're kind of a bit in the grey area between perennials and self-seeders, actually. Most commercial kales are biennial. They'll grow in 1 year and they'll flower and seed in the next, and then they'll die. So you do get kales which are a bit more perennial than that. They'll flower in the second year, but they'll survive that flowering. They won't put quite so much energy into it, so they'll go on year after year. Very few of them are really long-lived perennials. They'll generally live for about 5-6 years, and then in my experience, they get more and more susceptible to winter cold, and eventually they'll die over winter. But they will actually grow from cuttings and they'll even layer themselves. And new plants grown that way seem to sort of reset in terms of hardiness. So they can go on and on that way with a clone of the same plant. But they can also self-seed. And if you let them flower and seed, then you'll get seedlings coming up all over the place. And this gives you some very interesting possibilities, because obviously if you simply grow a clone year after year, it's always genetically the same. You never get any variety, you never get any new varieties. If you let it seed, you can cross it with your favourite biennial kales. So I have favourite kale variety, and I've crossed those with my perennial varieties. And I find there's a kind of sweet spot. The traditional perennials like Dobbington's kale actually very rarely flowers, so there aren't the opportunities actually for doing these crosses. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got the traditional biennial kales, which never survive their first flowering. What I find is you can select for a kind of sweet spot in between that. So the plants are flowering, but they're perennial. And this gives you the advantages of perenniality, but it also gives you the advantages of flowering and recombining. So you've got your favourite kales, but they're acting more like wild plants in a wilder system.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I don't want to give all your secrets away, and I'm not, because your book is absolutely packed full of information. But could you just tell us what you do with your radishes as well that might be a bit unusual or different?
Yeah, with the radishes, I grow them similarly, to be honest. I let them self-seed, and I select for characteristics that I am interested in. And partly I'm selecting for the pods. I pick the immature pods, and they go into the things like stir fries. And they've got a nice crunch, they've got a nice sort of radishy bite, and they're produced over a long period in abundance. But I'm also using the roots, and that tends to be in spring, and young roots like the way we traditionally grow radishes, but also ones which germinate in autumn. You can dig them up over the winter, more like the Oriental way of growing radishes. You get them as big, chunky vegetables.
Thanks, Alan. If you're interested in finding out about new plants, new growing techniques, and basically anything you ever wanted to know about forest gardens, I recommend following Alan's blog and getting hold of a copy of his fantastic latest book. Thank you to you for listening. Here's Dr. Ian Bedford talking about a pesky little bug that is actually very, very useful.
When little black flies come into our homes and begin flying around a fruit bowl, there'll almost certainly be a common fruit fly that's been attracted to a piece of fruit that's in the initial stages of rotting. Since fruit flies use their powerful olfactory senses to detect and follow the scent of fermentation juices that ooze from overripe fruit and on which they feed. And whilst there, they'll mate and lay eggs, which will hatch the following day into little maggots that flourish within the fruit's decaying flesh, rapidly maturing, pupating, and then emerging as another generation of fruit flies in as little as 10 days. But as annoying as fruit flies might be in the home, they're actually a natural indicator that it's time to sort out the old fruit and perhaps take it to the compost bin, where the flies' maggots can get on with their invaluable job of recycling. Interestingly though, the common fruit fly currently has another important role to play, a role that's of great value to us in helping us understand biotic systems and interactions. Since its rapid life cycle, ease of maintenance within a science lab, and the recent unravelling of its complete genome sequence have enabled it to become one of the world's most widely used organisms within genetic and biological research. And the fact that we share 40% of our genes with the common fruit fly allows it to be used as a genetic model for researching human diseases such as Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, and in the quest to understand the mechanisms of ageing, drug resistance, diabetes and cancer. So the next time fruit flies are being a bit of a nuisance in the home, it's worth sparing a thought for how they're helping us understand and improve on our health and well-being before swatting them with a tea towel.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.